the Savills session on Cities with Purpose. We're going to start with a short presentation from my colleague Iris Kampers, who is based in the Dutch office in Amsterdam, and then we'll follow with a panel discussion, and I'll introduce the panelists in a minute. But if you could welcome Iris to the stage. Thank you.
My name is Iris Kampers, and I am a biologist working for Savills, which is a real estate consultancy working across the world from the US to Australia, which really gives us a unique sort of perspective on the issues that we encounter in cities and how to solve these. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to show you a couple of concrete examples of the strategy deployed by Savills to tackle some of these issues. Well, that's really, you're going to hear me breathing a lot. Cities with purpose. Let's talk about cities with purpose, and let's start off with what is purpose, really. Purpose is the reason why a thing was created, and we look at cities this way. Cities or human settlements were created to bring people together, to provide protection, to provide shelter, to share resources, to be an economic hub, and for people to meet one another, to inspire one another. And as cities grew, are you coming to fix me? Sure, come on. Is that better? Are we happy? Good. Okay, so let's speak to cities with purpose. And if we look at cities these days, cities still fulfill that purpose. But as cities grew, they also lost some of the vital components that make cities healthy areas to live in. If we look at cities now, there was a survey done across 38 European cities, and they found that cities now, on average, have less than 3% green space. We all know, like we've heard a lot, that green space is really vital to any area, really, for health. So nowadays, we see cities as a place of congestion, of bad air quality. I mean, about 2 million people in London live in an area that has toxic air. It's quite bad. There's traffic jams, there's noise, there's all sorts of side effects that we didn't really anticipate when we started globalizing and moving into cities a lot. And this brings about its own share of climate-related issues. And if we look at a map of the country where I'm from, the Netherlands, you can clearly see the urban heat island effect here. The red areas show an increase in temperature of about 4 degrees in summer, as opposed to the rural areas. Can you imagine? It might be 25 degrees in the rural areas, and I'm already sweating in the cities. There's other problems here as well, problems with drainage, for example. Green areas work the water down into the soil, but in urban areas where we have a lot of stone and a lot of asphalt, this no longer happens, so we have flash floods, we have problems with the sewage systems. So cities now need to add a new purpose. They, on top of all the purposes that they already have, they need to be sustainable. And in order to talk a little bit about a sustainable system and what that looks like, obviously, the biologist is going to take you from the urban jungle into the actual jungle. Because if we look at jungles, these areas are teeming with life. There's a nutrient cycle going on. It is an optimized system. Everything has its purpose. There is no waste being generated. Climate is regulated. Nature does all these things in a closed-loop system. And that really is what sustainability is, isn't it? We've seen a lot of examples during the last 2 days of optimizing the system. There's some great minds here, some great startups that have shown us, if you optimize the system, that will lead to a more sustainable environment. And cities aren't bad per se. I mean, if we look at optimizing a system, I've rarely seen a more effective land use than a skyscraper housing all these different people or all these different people working there. It is a very efficient place for people to still exchange resources, to meet one another. Cities are really still very effective in that. but I wouldn't call them sustainable, and I wouldn't call this a closed-loop system. So as I said, I will now give you some examples as to how we went about this. And the first type of example that I want to give is how circularity can close the loop. I mean, what's in the name, right? Circularity. And to do this, I want to present our own office right here in Lisbon, which was recently refurbished to become a more sustainable building. And instead of looking for the newest development in town, Savills Portugal looked for a somewhat older building. They went into the building, they looked at the potential, they didn't tear down anything, they just refit the insides. This saves about 66% of CO2 emissions, so it's a very effective way, very efficient use of resources. They really optimized looking at what can we still do with this building. There is CO2 neutral furniture everywhere. Even the carpets are CO2 neutral to reduce the amount of waste and reduce the amount of materials that was needed to create this great office space. And I've worked there for the past week, and it really is a very pleasant area to be in. The photovoltaic panels on the roof provide 50 to 20% of the energy demand for the office building, for the HVAC, for the indoor lighting. The air is constantly being monitored. It really is a good example of how this can be made possible. It's not just talking about how the world is on fire and then leaving us in the dark as to what to do about it. This is a great example of how it was actually done. The second idea I want to share is on biodiversity. Once again, not really a big surprise coming from a biologist, but biodiversity can do the other thing that we need. It can meet our needs, because instead of trying to just close the loop, in order to optimize the system, we need to ask ourselves, do I really need a technological advancement for this? Or is there a natural equivalent that can do the exact same thing? And the first example is from the place where I work, Amsterdam. This is Rembrandt Park 2. And our agency team has been working on this. And one of the prime features of this building, I would say, is that they have employed green roofs. This doesn't just give people a good view when they're working, but it also has the potential to cool down the area around it by 4 degrees, which is exactly the urban heat island effect. It has the potential to store about 150 liters of water, which is about 200 bottles of wine for those of you starting early today. It has the potential to bring back biodiversity. It has the potential to clean the air. And even if you look at the front of the building, because this was actually realized in this exact way, instead of just putting down a parking lot, they chose to put down a park, a meeting place for people, a place where people can take a walk during luncheon, with all these added benefits that we've already seen. Second example is in London, where our head office is. This is the White City Place in London. And the Savills team did an ecological study here, determining, what is some of the potential of the urban area and the green space that is on there. And what they found was that this was actually a prime spot for urban farming. You know, right? It looks really fancy, and now they're doing urban farming. So they put down a polytunnel, which allows plants to grow, the seedlings to grow in a protected space. They added an educational program to teach kids how to farm in an urban environment. They can now grow up to 2 kilos of fruit and vegetables per square meter in this area, which is quite a lot. And they do something quite nice with that, because every year they host an annual dinner, and all the parents can come and see what their kids have grown and enjoy the food. And on top of that, they've even made an innovation hub, challenging different startups to come up with technology to help with the harvest, to show these kids how to go about building robots. Really great examples of how an urban area can come back to life, adding green space, adding these two different types of thinking into our cities. Now, on a final note, because I've gone quite quickly through this, we see that cities need a new purpose. We see that cities need to be more sustainable, and we've heard it all for 2 days. The world is on fire and we need to do something. But rather than reject all the history that we've had so far, let's look into the spaces that we've already populated, ask ourselves what is the most efficient way to use these resources, and then look into what we're going to do moving forward. This is exactly what we're going to do during the panel, I do think. So if we're all done for the panel, if everyone's ready in the audience, let's move on and let's talk about more great examples for cities with purpose. Thank you so much.
So I'm welcoming to the stage Will and Mila, who is very graciously standing in for Marilyn Hamilton, who's been taken ill with COVID. And we have up on the very big screen in full height, Eduard. So absolutely delighted to have you with us here today. So following on from Iris's fantastic presentation and the invitation to talk about concrete examples of where we've taken cities forward, challenging those perceptions that cities are negative, that they are the source of problems, whether they're societal or ecological. I would like to invite Mila to talk about some of her work across the world, where she has been involved in the paradigm shifts and societal changes needed to bring around community building and engagement.
Thank you. I'm not quite hearing you, by the way.
Sorry.
But I'm seeing you talking. Hello, my other selves. Hello, my relations. That's how I start any introduction. So I love the presentation about cities with purpose. I think that's where we need to start. And also understanding a shift that is needed, and also an unlearning about how we live together, which is about, this is a living system that is constantly moving, and it needs every participant, including the non-humans, to be part of that conversation. So community building, yes, and you need people from all diverse kind of representations of society, from youth to elders. Could you imagine what if we gave to the children? How would you redesign a city in a way that is lives in alignment to how nature works, how living system actually works? How can it be integral to Marilyn's point? So how do you do that? How do you come together? And there are many specific examples. As I said, Curitiba in Brazil has been doing this for 20 years. There's many in Europe. There's many in Asia on really looking at not just green kind of cities, but green in terms of how actually ecosystem work, and having urban forest, urban drainage system, urban canals that are not from concrete. So not just having parks, but real nature spots that's living in harmony with humans in the way it actually interacts. And also bringing voices that are not typical, like there's the indigenous wisdom. There's the Sustainable Indigenous Wisdom Conference, where Dr. Darcia Navarez, who's a neurobiologist, talks about how some of these indigenous pathways could be really useful in how cities actually work. Because back in many centuries ago, there were already cities, like in Egypt, like in many different Roman empires, that really worked with societies, including indigenous. So what about if we created living labs where we actually learn from each other and look at, in the cities, all the local successes, local stories, and support them to scale up in conversation and in discussion, in agreement with urban planners, with architects, with government, but from an ecosystem lens, not a silo lens, not having the water planners on one side, the urban planners on another, the architects on another. So this was a great example that Iris gave, but I would invite to go further. What other potentiality that we're not even thinking of? Maybe a pink city, like Eduard said yesterday, but anything could be possible, right? So I just think that there are many different ways of doing this, and we need to be careful that it doesn't become a blueprint. Because the city in Europe is going to be very different a city in Jakarta or in China or in Latin America. There's this tendency to go into blueprints. And I think that is really not aligned to how actual ecosystem work. And we need to be mindful, to Marilyn's point, that everything is evolving. So there needs to be an evolutionary intelligence in how we design this going forward.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it gives me the opportunity then to invite Eduard to talk about the role of education and community building and the work that he's had founding the university, which I think has been going for now 26 years?
28.
28, my apologies.
Okay, yes. Iris gave us an introduction about cities with purpose. And I think that is a very big question. If we look at Singapore, for example, it's considered one of the best cities in Asia. But Singapore's footprint is 13,400% higher than its biocapacity. So we build 10 Singapores, we kill the planet. So it depends on what we're actually looking at and what we want. I would say, yes, cities need to be sustainable, but right now, if we look at the planetary boundaries approach, we've gone into the high-risk area for humanity, for our safe operating space, how they call it in Stockholm and a resilience center. We need to bring nature back. We need to bring life back to the planet before we can achieve any sustainability. I think that the sustainability train left and we didn't get on it. So we really need to make conditions for sustainability to be achieved in the future. So in my part of the world, cities are now housing 80 or more % of the population. And as Iris mentioned, they were not established for nature, they were established for people. And they were established for a lot of people, and a lot of people came and migrated to these cities thinking they had better opportunities for living. Now we're seeing a counter effect in some places where people are moving back into the rural areas. But to go forward, cities must play an important part in human livelihood, but we need biodiversity to be also a citizen. Eduard, who was working with us in our team, he was a mayor of a city close to San Jose, and he declared earthworms and pollinators citizens. And that gave him a different status. So a city should not interrupt the ecological function of a landscape. It should allow for biology, ecology to flow through the city. So we need biological corridors. I love green rooftops, but we need more than that. We need to allow nature to be able to move back and forth through the city and actually make people start understanding that we don't need to take care of nature, it takes care of us. If it functions, we survive. If it doesn't function, we are gone. And we made a mistake in environmental education telling people we had to take care of nature, so people think that by planting a tree and recycling a bottle, they're doing a good job. No, we really need to respect nature. And if you look at the 4 months vacation we gave it during COVID at the beginning, it just came back. So it's telling us, I'm still willing to work with you. Give me a chance and I'll clean the air, I'll clean the oceans, I'll bring life back. So we still have time. Now, how do we do this? How do we scale it? We need to educate, and very few universities are preparing current people for what is already here. We're still preparing people for the last century, or before the last century. We're not preparing young people to face the challenges that are already here with us. Sea level rise. Israeli scientists published last week is 1 meter by 2050. That brings a lot of cities underwater. So how are we going to reverse this? We don't have to learn how to build more walls to avoid the ocean coming into the cities. We need to bring carbon down. And parks in the city, green gardens in the city, if we look at the soil and look at it as a living ecosystem, it has the capacity to bring carbon down. We can turn every single organic waste in a city into compost in a system that incentivizes to bring back life in the soil throughout the whole city, every single garden. Get rid of exotic plants and put in native plants where bees and other pollinators can live, where earthworms can survive. And the cities will start helping. So we need to educate a lot of people. We're actually launching, beginning of next year, educational hive, where we expect to train and educate thousands of people around the world in a network of institutions linked to bioregional places. So we can have students do regeneration projects around the world linked to a mentor network and start co-creating solutions together. We need to get out of the silos, and we need to make this education very democratic, accessible for all, and work together. Start co-creating these new innovative solutions and go beyond pilot projects. Pilot projects are not going to take us there. We need to really massively turn this into mainstream.
No, I agree. And I can understand the tentavation with that, the nervousness around investing a lot of money, and a pilot program is a useful way of testing that in a safe way. But if it's not embedded as part of a larger strategy, then it really is the opportunity to say, well, we've done that, it didn't work, depending on the performance indicators you're looking for. But if I could now turn to Will, because you've, as former mayor of Austin, a city that I knew was lauded as an urbanist, was lauded as the best place to live in America. And some of the strategies you've employed there, obviously, have had a very positive impact, both on the environment and the community there. And yesterday, in an earlier panel, you alluded to the challenges of supporting those at the lower end of the economic scale, and the necessity of building and supporting those communities and moving forward. And when that works positively for one community, it works positively for everybody. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, I will say that as originally a practicing architect, one of the really positive trends that I certainly have experienced in the U.S., but I think it's also global as cities continue to grow and attract more citizens, is that the younger working generation, those young people from 25 to 40 years old, say, are now far more attracted to a dense urban core than were at least the last couple of generations after World War II. Post World War II, we saw cities expand their boundaries, if you will, usually in these unsustainable sort of single-use, low-density type development. Everybody lives over here, they work over here, they shop here, they go to school here, they worship there, they work out here, and we wonder why traffic is bad, air quality is bad, quality of life worsens. But the younger generation, this past decade or more, have been really just flocking into an urban core that in some places has been not abandoned, but certainly ridiculously underutilized. And the positive opportunity, and Iris, some of her slides show that, is we have a chance to reinvent our urban core, both what I call the urban fabric. And as an architect, I tend to think more of the fabric being the actual buildings and the pavement and the green space. But over time, my thinking evolved into, this urban fabric that is a part of the answer we're part of the fabric, right? The human beings and the citizens and the animals and nature, as we saw earlier, is part of this fabric. And so I'm encouraged that despite the clock ticking on our global challenge of climate change and sea level rise and warming temperatures, challenges with storm systems and both droughts and tragic floods, ironically, in the same year, is that with help we can reinvent these urban cores where the clear majority, ultimately the vast majority of humanity will be residing and working and living, with more sound practices. And we've seen some this last couple of days here in Lisbon, but we also, hopefully, many of us have been experiencing some of them across, back in our hometowns or as we travel. That this fabric is your homeless population. It's your daytime workers, people who come into the city, work, and then leave. It's the people who live in the city, and probably work there as well. It's the wildlife that tries to survive or coexist. Many of our cities, Austin is one, we have a river running right through the middle of our downtown. Many cities, of course, were originally cited, because of access to water, either a shoreline or a riverbank. And so as you have this thread, ecological thread, frequently running through your city, that needs to be the heart and soul of the strategy to reinvent this fabric, and and slowly reclaim, let nature reclaim its important role in how a dense urban environment can coexist and thrive. And I'll just tell you, as a former mayor, a former practicing architect, a frequent attendee of events like this, I'm more encouraged than I've been, say, than the last decade, to see material science has improved so dramatically. Ecological awareness is up dramatically. I think there's more of a recognition that it's less about our carbon footprint than it is about the societal mix and success of our populations. And I really applaud the attendees and the speakers and the presentations here with Planetiers that allows us to continue to march forward. And the cities are super challenging. They're challenging to govern. We see governments change frequently. We saw this the UK this week for very different reasons. But I just think the awareness is there, and I think there's a strong enough set of intellectual capacity that and the science that can lead us into this march of reinventing how we think about urban cores and dense metropolises, and it's the people that live, work, and play there.
Yeah. No, because before I joined Savills a few months ago, I've been teaching on a graduate level architecture course in the UK, and I'd noticed, specialising in the research module, I'd noticed the students shifting in their intentions and their focus on the research project from a couple looking at issues around sustainability out of a group of about 20 odd to now over half in the year looking at specifically at various sustainability issues, from building fabric to social sustainability and to well-being. So the future is with, I think, the young people coming through, but it shouldn't be on their shoulders to resolve all of the issues that we face. But given that Will has identified one particular age group as the way forward, Iris, yes, I'm going to throw to you. One of the things I think, picking up from the presentations, and something I'm particularly keen on because I've done this in my own career, is moving between sectors. and the interesting opportunities that you can get cross-pollinating ideas when you move from one sector to another. So as a biologist in a real estate company, which must blow a lot of people's minds out, could you follow on from what Will was saying about how you then look at restoring nature, and nature not just these little patches of green spaces, islands of green for a couple of pollinators maybe, and how we can integrate that to actually become physically greener cities, not just carbon neutral cities?
Yes, okay, that's a long question. I need to digest a little bit what was said by these amazing people here. So, first off, yes, I was talking this morning to Will in the around coffee really, and we said, you know, this is the type of person that we really need, and we see a lot of, well, I'll talk for my own age group, but a lot of people my age that sort of feel this pressure to choose a profession really early on in life and then sort of stick to it. Whereas Will and I both had, well, I obviously didn't have the same length of career as you did already, but we both are quite sort of stubborn people who think, well, I'll just try something different now. And it really sort of develops into a unique view, and yes, people are still relatively amazed at, you know, changing that around a little bit. To go into using these spots, I actually like that, do I say Dr. Müller or do I say Eduard?
Edward, please.
Edward. Okay, Edward, thank you. What Edward was saying about, no, we shouldn't do just these pilot projects. Well, we all both know, as he's a specialist of regenerative, can I say urbanization?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go for that one. We shouldn't, like, any ecological system only works when it's connected in this larger sort of plane, which is why I definitely agree that it shouldn't just be the pilot project. It should be sort of a chain of things. And I actually like what Will said about, you know, the river being the heart of it. And I would be really interested to hear from Mila what she thinks on, you know, how do you then go about that, developing that urban or that river area into something that's actually helps the community? How do we build something? As an ecologist working in a real estate company, I would say take that core as a string and then cooperating with different parties, because that's obviously one of the bigger challenges whenever you want to develop anything. With different stakeholders and different parties, look into what really should be the main purpose of that riverbank. And you've been in Brisbane. It has an amazing riverbank with all these sort of social aspects. It's really green, relatively. It works as a sort of a flood plain if it really overflows badly there. Well, you'll know more about this. And I do think that that is the way that we should sort of redevelop our thinking, and then keep in mind that connectivity. But you definitely need those different stakeholders and those different people hopping into different areas, thinking, well, I'll just try looking at this from a different angle for a while.
Yes, Will and I were talking earlier about the potential of Olympic bids. So I have a background in research in mega events, and the potential of those events to be able to deliver large-scale urban regeneration projects. And both Sydney and London have managed to completely transform urban waterways, large-scale urban parks, to become incredibly biodiverse. So not just green parks with lots of lawn where people could go, but a variety of grasslands and meadowlands and tree planting and water marshes and floodplains, because London is also susceptible to flooding and needs to move forward. But the work that they did in both of those locations with the local communities to bring them in and engage on conversations, there will always be criticism of the Olympics and the way that you develop and engage with those, particularly cities like Rio and in Beijing. But there are still opportunities, and I think we need to be positive and optimistic and face forward and move towards the future on this. So.
Yeah, and if I might just add on that a little bit, what I think that we need to do is focus on these integral solutions. Because if you develop a city like a living system, by adding these sort of integral solutions, so a green roof, I've already talked about this a lot now, but it adds a lot of different functionalities. It'll actually also create a meeting place for people, it'll increase the health of the city. So I think that really is key. We shouldn't just look at our own little sort of specialism, but look beyond that and think, okay, so how many different functions could I possibly plot into one single square meter?
Yeah, in a presentation yesterday, Mila highlighted very successful strategy in Nottingham, which is my hometown. And so I was delighted to hear that, because nobody ever talks about Nottingham. And I rattle on about it all the time, because they've made great strides in addressing both the urban greening, but have developed a strategy called Breathing Space as a policy document. And it's not just there for increasing biodiversity, but the core function of that is to address some of the socio-economic challenges and the health of citizens, which in Nottingham, they have 3 of the worst areas in the country, which is not really what most people would associate with Nottingham. And so you can see that once you then start to focus on the environment, you can then have a positive effect on people's personal health. And not just that, the opportunity for jobs and education, which goes back to Eduard's earlier point about engaging people and education and the need for education going forwards about a range of issues. So, Mila, you were talking yesterday about the connectivity and the mycelium of structural changes that need to occur to have these conversations go forward. Could you expand on that? And not necessarily talk about Nottingham again, but you had, although you can if you want to.
Not about Nottingham.
Yes.
Well, as I said, there's several examples, and it's just doing the research that most of you are doing, Dr. Miller is doing. It's also not just looking at the cities, it's how the cities are interconnected, because how ecosystem and living system works is at bioregional level, to Dr. Miller's point. And there are instances now that cities and rural villages are coming together to work together on a bioregional scale. So not just looking at the city, but the connectivity of that city, of the well-being of any society depends on the well-being of the environment that it sits in. And it's not just in the city, because those cities have myceliums and connectivity to the rural areas as well as the bioregion. When I say bioregion, the watersheds, the mountains, the air, all of this are integrated. So when you're designing this, it needs to be mindful of the connection that exists that are both visible and invisible. And to your point, Iris, about where do you start? It's and also to build on what Dr. Miller says, it depends on the actual construct, environmental landscape that city sits in or the community sits in. So it's that purpose becomes very different from one to the other in a very, kind of Spain kind of area versus Latin America versus Indonesia, where I come from, tropical island, is so different. So we need to really understand the connectivity of not only the humans, but how the water connects to the watershed, how the land and the air connects to each other, and designing from that space. And also be mindful that the humans have a role in that as guardians of the stewardship of the environment that they sit in, not only within their city, but beyond in the bioregional space. And in that, there's a neurobiologist called Dr. Dacia Navarez, who looks at indigenous wisdom as well as how community, how groups and cities are formed. And fundamentally, her research came down to connection, surprise, surprise. It's a connection in a community that trusts each other, that builds a relationship, a local neighborhood, that you really can rely on another person that you just trust. You go to the next door, hey, babysit my children, or just ask for support or help, or have fun in the city, in the streets. and connecting to the environment that it is. What she found was that when we moved into the city, we disconnected from that biological rewiring of our DNA as humans. So this is really necessary to bring a transdisciplinary approach to this, not just for the collaboration from transportation to urban to architect, but the societal, the economical, as well as the environmental, the politics. All of those are so integrated that it's not a one-way solution. It really needs to have all the people in the conversation. So one of the things that I would do is that chair is empty. I'll put 2, 3, 4 chairs. What are the conversations here that we're having that those voices are not being heard, right? Just even if we talk about Nottingham, if we talk about London or Austin, who are those conversations? Who are that needs to be sitting in those seats? Right. And maybe one of us can take that seat and come from the voice of nature, the voice of children, the voice of elders, the voice of the water. Only then we will know where the heart is. It's impossible for me to say, oh, the heart is always in the water. If it's a rural area where there's no water, how do you find it? And I went to Colombia recently, to up in the mountains called a place called Barichara, which is far from Bogota. And they taught us in the last 10 years how they came in as a community, not only in their village, but all the villages that used to fight each other, that used to kill each other. But fundamentally, it was built on trust. So how do we create in cities local neighborhoods that are connected to each other? Like to your point, Austin, how can they go to work in that area? How can they support each other in that area, then connect to another local neighborhood? So how do they act locally and collaborate regionally and learn as a city, as an ecosystem, and share that on a platform? And then how do you take that at scale level, not at volume, but at network of networks of cities and rural areas at bi-regional scale? So those are kind of things in terms of connectivity. It's beyond what we think connection is. Not just looking at living system, but all of the different pieces that are working together and being very mindful who are the voices in this conversation that are not on the table.
Absolutely.
Including women.
I'm going to invite, on that last note of women, but I'm going to invite Eduard to comment on that because he was nodding ferociously during part of that presentation. So what would you like to add to Mila's comments there?
Yeah, look, the definition of sustainable development is over 35 years old, and we never got to implement it. So we need to go beyond talking and go into action. And I think one of the key things is this movement to a holistic approach, which for some academics is something that really makes them itchy, because we need to break the walls between the different departments. We need to, and that's where the bioregion comes in. You can bring, as Mila said, you bring the chairs in, and you fit the people from different perspectives and discuss the same problems. But then I think in terms of education, we need to give hope. And we're still on time. When I say I don't care about adaptation to climate change, I'm not going to sit down and learn to live in a collapsing planet if we still have time to revert this. And that's where youth has to be positive and have hope. But they need a holistic approach. We launched 4 years ago the first regenerative entrepreneurship program globally. And so students go through a very different holistic approach. We go from environment to spirituality, economics, culture, society, and even politics. And this current cohort, we have several students from Africa. And one of them from Ghana, he is turning his village into a food forest. So this is food, good quality food, no transportation, ready to pick off the trees and the plants. Bringing pollinators back, bringing biodiversity back, lowering the temperature of his town, and generating a whole bunch of new businesses for his friends that don't have jobs. Yeah. So you can actually revive if you just move away, and you said it, Iris, about moving away from your own profession. We need to get out of these silo boxes and really start thinking of holistic approaches. When we talk about biophilic cities, it's not only putting trees in the city. It's the whole concept of a living space, a living ecosystem, and that we are part of that ecosystem. So unless we convince ourselves that nature does not need us, but we need nature, and we are part of nature, I don't think we'll be able to move forward. So let's give hope to youth. We can still build the better future through regeneration. We need to look at, from Horizon 1, what is left over that can be used, and just make everything obsolete. So instead of fighting the system, as Bucky Fuller said, we need to build a better system that will make the old one obsolete. It's useless to fight the cops. It's useless to fight politicians. It's useless to fight academics that are still in their reductionist little world. They can keep on doing their work, no problem. But we need something else. So we need to really build a third horizon, a horizon of hope, a horizon of results, of abundance. We need to go from perverse economy of scarcity to an economy of abundance. We need to move away from GDP. GDP never, ever was a measurement of well-being. It's a measurement of money flow, and still our universities are teaching GDP. Our universities are teaching us to kill the soil by plowing it and putting fertilizers and putting pesticides. They're still teaching it. We don't need a drop of fertilizer. In our Regenerative Costa Rica initiative, we are just demonstrating that we can produce abundant food, 35, 40 different products in the same space. People are eating very nutritious food without a drop of chemicals and bringing life back. We have 50% more insects flying in our regenerative food farms than in national parks. Look at that. I mean, usually people that are doing agriculture, they don't want a single insect in their plot. And we have more bats coming back. Bats, they're a huge indicator for biodiversity. Now we're measuring birds. This is part of the metrics a mayor should be using. How many birds, how many pollinators, how many hummingbirds in our case are back in the city? How many different species of hummingbirds are flying around? Eduard, the mayor for the city, it's called now Sweet City, you can look it up. He threw down his garage, sold his car, and built a second garden for another hummingbird because they're territorial. So he had one in the back of his garden, which kept fighting and moving all the others. So he built another garden. And through that, he turned this city into a garden for life. And that is what young people need to know. We still have hope. We still can do it. We need to rush. I mean, the clock is ticking. But let's move away from the reductionist approach, go to a holistic understanding. Spiritual component is fundamental. That is deep consciousness. Understanding our active role. And we can solve this. We can reverse climate change in this decade if we just move on to regenerative cattle and regenerative agriculture, which is causing 80% of global collapse. And I'm not going to go into that detail now, but we are able to show that we can pull carbon from the sky and put it beneath our feet, even in the central park of a city.
I think that's a very good platform then to move on to final comments in the last few minutes of this. So Mila, what would you like people to take away from this session into the final 1 minute pitch for where we go from here?
Well, one of the things I said yesterday, and I'll continue to say it, when everything is interconnected at visible, invisible level, interdependent of each other, everything matters. If you survive, that means I survive. If you flourish, that means I flourish. And it's not just the humans, but everything that makes me alive and flourishing every day, and also being mindful that there's a life cycle that we're part of, an evolutionary life cycle that is regenerative. The death needs to be part of that because the death is the compost for new birth. And to, Dr. Miller's point, how do we all co-create a new system that becomes a dominant system? How do we put all of our energies into that? So when everything is interconnected, interdependent, everything matters.
Yeah. Thank you. And Will?
I think a big takeaway, certainly for me, I hope for a lot of people, is that it's no longer, measuring carbon reduction or offsets. It's if we take a holistic approach at the whole concept of sustainability, the carbon is going to come down. And so it's, I think many of us has focused too long, exclusively on carbon and reducing and offsetting, et cetera. But again, as we heard and we see, when nature flourishes, carbon comes down.
Fantastic, thank you. And Iris?
Yeah. Yesterday I was on a panel and I got the question, doing more sustainable things, does that start at home or do we do that as a whole sort of community? And one thing I would like to say to people here to make it really sort of concrete and dumb it down is the only reason why some of the projects that were shown had happened is because we have bold people that are willing to be creative about this, that have pushed against the boundaries of what was deemed possible, what was deemed feasible, and are
economically viable.
Economically viable, and they weren't afraid to challenge that status quo. Our amazing architect, Nuno Fidesz, I hope I pronounced that right, he has a great opportunity to pitch for this, and he just went for it. And that is what I think our company has done really well, is it allows people to be creative. So whichever job you have, whichever opportunity you get, be creative, be bold, say this is where we draw the line and I want to do it differently.
Thank you. And I will offer the final words to Eduard.
My sky is starting to become light. It's 4:50 in the morning here.
Oh no!
And the birds are starting to sing. So there's a lot of background noise. I hope my computer filters that out. But it's just beautiful to be in the jungle with the waking up of a new day. And I think that is it. We have a chance to wake up to many new days and just go into action. Let's not discuss more about what's sustainable, what regenerative, what is it regenerative agriculture, is it agroecology? So many people are stuck in definitions. So many people are just trying to make it perfect. We don't have to be perfect. Nature's not perfect, it's adaptive. So let's just start walking, let's move on. We need action now. I have a 10-year-old and I'm just so scared that he is not going to get to half my age in the planet I would like to be living in. So we don't have time to keep on discussing. These conferences are beautiful, but if we go home and we go back to the same stuff we were doing before a conference, we're not going to move. So we need action, action, action. We need holistic approaches. We need collaboration. Let's create a network around the world to co-create solutions, to say, look, I'm doing this. What are you doing? Can we know? So we don't need the perfect science. I always say to my students and when I give talks, this is the best scientifically documented planetary extinction. We have all the science to know why we're going to die. So let's move forward and give our young people the chance to move on and create a future of well-being, of abundance, of regeneration. And the planet is still working with us. I mean, Mother Nature really gave us a good present this time because it put everybody on its knees. Not only the vulnerable people that usually were the ones affected by droughts and floods, the people in the cities, they brought the food from Vietnam instead of from Japan or whatever if it was missing. So let's think about it. Nature's giving us a chance. And if we grab that chance, I'm totally convinced, having been working on this for 45 years, that before 2030, let's not think of 2050, because if we think of 2050, we're doomed by the time we get there. This is exponential, and we're not taught to think exponentially. So biodiversity loss is exponential. Latin America has lost 94% of the abundance of biodiversity, 94%. And people are still thinking of species lost. It's ridiculous. We're talking about function here. So let's just get together, grab our hands, let's educate around the planet, let's co-create solutions. Most of the knowledge we need is there, but we have to experiment. And failure is also part of experimenting. So let's not expect to have the perfect solution. Let's work with nature and be flexible and move on. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the final words are collaborate, educate, innovate, and action. So thank you very much. I would like to thank my fantastic panelists, Eduard, Mila, Will, and Iris, and thank you very much for sitting here and allowing us to share with you some of the experience and the knowledge that we have. Thank you very much.
Yeah.